late. Okay. Right. So yeah, as I said, in the room, we've got me. So I'm Nick Glover, Student Voice Manager at YUSU. And then we've got Effie. Do you want to introduce yourself again?
Yeah, so yeah, I was Community and Wellbeing Officer from 2018 to 2020. So whoever gets the Community and Wellbeing Officer role this year coming will be my grand sab. So it's very exciting. The family grows.
Excellent. That is a little bit weird, but I quite like that concept.
Nick.
No, I'm joking. Right, Effie, I'm going to ask you the first question before we kind of get into the slides. So this session, I was hoping that we'd, with the people in the room and people watching back, that we'd provide some inspiration and give them some energy and some fire for either, you know, running an election or whatever their activist or change making endeavors after this. So can you talk me through a little bit about your activist journey? Like, how did you find your, I'm gonna use the phrase activist identity a lot in this session. I hope people are okay with that. But yeah, how did you find it, and what was your journey, and where are you now with everything?
Do you want just a uni time or like a general?
Yeah, just a uni time. But I suppose what initially, you know, because people don't find their activist identity all the time. So was there a specific trigger at university? What made you run for Spectral Officer, for example?
Okay. So before uni, I would say that I originally had a fairly privileged background. And I wasn't really exposed to much diversity. I grew up in the Southwest. It was very much, everyone was pretty much exactly the same. And then when I turned 17, 18, everything fell apart. My parents lost their jobs, we lost our house, and I was suddenly exposed to a completely different side of the world that I had never, ever encountered before. And suddenly I was like, oh, this isn't fun at all. I took a year off before uni to raise money so that I could afford to come. And then when I arrived as a student in the complete opposite circumstances to that I'd kind of always grown up expecting to arrive to uni in. So I had no money whatsoever. I, as a disabled student, I had a lot of limitations put on my ability to learn. And I had quite extreme mental health problems when I arrived as well. And I was like, right, okay, it's fine. Let's just keep going. And one of the first things I encountered at York was Open Door and the extremely long wait list then. I think, because this was, oh my gosh, this is horrifying. This was 6 years ago now, so 2015. And it was insane. It was absolutely insane. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, this is a nightmare. And going through a situation where I was on, you know, the max bursary I could possibly get, had the max amount of financial support I could possibly get. But because I was in a disabled room, I still had no money because it was so expensive. And I started noticing all these little problems that previously I don't think I'd have quite clocked. And I was like, right, I can't afford to do things that other people can. I'm missing out on opportunities. I didn't join any societies or sports teams or do anything in my first year because I was too scared to do anything. And I think that was sort of what drove me to apply for my college committee in my second year. So I ran in James College and I got the Community and Wellbeing Officer for James. And it was there that I felt I could really make a difference and like start doing, like working on the little things that I'd noticed around the college that were causing me some problems, and work more closely with the SABs at YUSU to try and combat some of those bigger things. And it sort of spiraled from there, I think, is suddenly you start seeing the problems and seeing what you think are decent solutions, but noticing things aren't changing or noticing things aren't happening. And I started asking around, I started speaking with different staff members, I started getting to know the part-time officers at YUSU more and sort of speaking through their experiences. And eventually I got to my third year, and I'd worked quite closely with the two community and wellbeing officers before. And I thought, actually, there's so much here that I think I could change. And I've been through these services and I've seen firsthand what isn't working. And I think I know things that could work, and I think I know how to make that difference. And that was kind of what led me to run in the first place, with that sort of desire to combat mental health problems at York, and particularly accommodation costs. And then it was going around that week actually campaigning and speaking to different students and understanding their own problems. I was like, there is so much more to this that I can do. And that's what sort of led me to different campaigns and different avenues of activism, was like gathering those other opinions of students about what the changes they wanted to see. Because it's not always the big stuff, it's the little things like the signage that can actually make a huge difference to somebody's uni experience. It's a very long-winded answer, but there you go.
No, that's perfect. I'm sure that was inspirational to those in the room, and and watching back as well. And I suppose my activist identity or journey, I mean, I was a bit of a selfish teenager, really, just head down doing my work and playing football. But I suppose it, like lots of people, it started at university for me, but especially my master's degree, I think became a lot more critically minded and thinking about global development and all that kind of stuff on my peace studies masters. And I suppose that's what really got me going. And then traveling in India as well, seeing global poverty and real inequality that maybe I hadn't been awakened to before, really made me think I want to, I don't just want to get a job that pays loads of money. I want to try and change the world. I know that sounds grandiose, but like you said, it's in any small way or big way that you can. And then I won't say which political party, but I worked for an MP for a certain political party, and that was another aspect of getting into political campaigning and fighting for certain causes, especially in Batley and Spen, where I'm from, especially around kind of religious conflict and conflict within communities and inequality as well. And then it brought me to student unions, where my current activist identity is all about, big up to student unionism, is all about students and all about students as partners, and making sure that I'm helping develop the next generation of activists, and developing students' activist identities and working with SABs to cultivate and grow theirs. So mine's now a kind of train the trainer activist identity, which is very cool. So yeah, that was our activist journeys and identities. Okay, so for the rest of the session, I'll keep bringing Effie in with very difficult questions, if that's all right with you, Effie. But we're going to talk about student activism in a bit of context, because I think there's lots of things going on at the minute that are providing fertile ground for student activism, as well as making things difficult. So we'll put it into some kind of context. And then I'm hoping that Effie's going to outline exactly why student activism is so important to get the fire going in everyone, both in the room and watching it back. And then we're going to go back to activist identity now. We're going to explore a few tools, an amazing framework that I found through reading about activism and cultivating activism by a woman called Jasmine Williams. So we're going to be looking at some reflective questions that you can ask yourself to get you thinking about your own activism and your own values and where you want to direct your energy. And then the last bit will be about student activism as leadership. Often I think activists are described as kind of counter to leaders, or you can't be an activist in a formal position of leadership, for example, or vice versa. And I think we want to dispel that myth, and hopefully Effie is a living embodiment of the myth that you can't be an activist as well as a democratically elected leader or a leader, as we say. Okay, cool. And I don't know if you want to chip in here, Effie, because I suppose that when Laura asked me to do a session on activism, I started thinking about the current context, and I think it's providing such a fertile ground for student activism. And some of those things on the slide there that I could think of in particular that happened, I suppose, last year and are currently happening for students. So I'm thinking in particular about George Floyd and I suppose the reinvigoration of Black Lives Matter. I suppose that was last spring and summer, wasn't it? And there was an amazing, not just in the States, obviously, but groundswell of particularly students, I think, and student unions and people in universities talking about this stuff, trying to educate other students, attending lectures, putting on their own events, grassroots events, all around racism, and conversations around allyship and all that kind of stuff. And I think students are at the forefront of that. What do you think about that, Effie? Because I know you're quite heavily involved in YUSU's response, weren't you, to George Floyd?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about being a student is you're kind of crossing that threshold from sort of, you tend to be from sort of young adult into sort of a fully fledged, I say person, like not that we were not people before, but you're suddenly exposed to so many different scenarios that you just didn't have an option to view when you're younger. And I think that helps radicalize people in a really positive way, because you're meeting people from loads of different backgrounds, you're understanding their lived experiences as well as your own, and through the sort of university atmosphere and through the lectures and the education you're getting, you're learning so much more about how you can apply your own knowledge and your own experience into actually making a change. I think the Black Lives Matter movement was a really, really important one, because and one of the most important things to sort of acknowledge in that, York is incredibly white. And so we were in a position to acknowledge our own sense of privilege, acknowledge our own situation, and say, what can we do to help make life better for students of colour? And, you know, we have some amazing BAME officers, and there's a lot of movement happening at the university, but this gave us a lot of traction to say there's so much more we can do. And because a lot of people are coming in with these really new ideas and new experiences, everybody knows that there are activists of every generation, but every single generation has completely new ideas of how to do it.
Yeah.
So we're in a great position to be like, actually, you've done amazing stuff and we've seen what you're doing, but we need you to do this. And so students are in a really good position to be that, you know, highly educated group of people who understand the world around them, who know what they're doing, and who are able to actually say, I can be the change because I have all the abilities within me to do that. And, you know, backing yourself and being able to say to and challenge, you know, university senior managers or politicians and stuff like that, like you have a really good backing to do that a lot of people don't have access to. So it's put you in a real position of sort of power and influence as a student.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. We'll touch upon academic or scholarly activism later, because I think that's a really good point, that you can become elected to student union. There are so many student groups that you can get involved into to educate yourself and form campaigns and be part of campaigns. But it's also, you're studying constantly, or you should be anyway, kind of critical theories, and you're learning new things in a university environment. So it's a kind of fertile ground for developing your activism and getting involved there. Just some other things, I suppose, that is providing a particularly fertile ground at the minute for student activism, the Me Too movement as well. And obviously, I put sexual violence and Me Too because the Me Too is a movement. I think sexual violence has never stopped, obviously, in gender-based violence, and I think it's I'm sure it's not becoming an increasingly problem. I think it's just a problem. I think there's more language and there's more knowledge and awareness around it now. There's some great work by people at York, by students at York and across the country and US, and people part of the national movement to shed a light on what's happening on campus, but also in the world at large as well. The climate emergency is a huge one. I think more than the other things I've mentioned, students and the youth, we'll use the American term there, the youth, including school-age children, are massively at the forefront of the climate emergency, kind of spearheaded by Greta and everyone else. And that's certainly happened in York, and we'll come to that in the next slide as well. And then obviously COVID-19 as well. I think that since COVID, I don't know if there's research in there, or there's certainly articles in the press and some of the higher education sector publications about how COVID's precipitated radicalism and activism within students. And unfortunately, that's largely based on how pissed off students are. I said I wasn't going to swear, but I said pissed off. How angry students are. And we've seen that in petitions and open letters to ministers and to vice chancellors, obviously, here at York as well. There's been huge campaigns around the safety net campaign, and students asking for better support and a better reflection for the university to better reflect the fact that COVID-19 has been a struggle and has affected students' learning. And I think actually lots of that activism, we'll come to that in a sec, has been successful. Educational inequalities, I think that goes without saying really, but it's still higher education, in particular, obviously schools as well, but higher education institutions are still places of inequality. They still reproduce inequality across racial lines, gender, and class as well. And then government approaches to HE, which ties into COVID, as going to try to be neutral as a student union workshop. Obviously, we can't be party political in any way. We can scrutinise the government, so that's okay. I would say FE might be able to be a bit more free and easy about what you say, but the government approaches to students in particular, I think, have been pretty shoddy. I think students have been largely forgotten about. during COVID-19, the impacts, I think, it's not necessarily been the sexiest area of policy for the government to focus on, and therefore that's really affected students. I don't know if you want to come in on that.
I spent a significant portion of my 2 years as a SAB working with the government and local government and sitting in the House of Lords at the all-party parliamentary group for students, just infuriated by the brick wall that was facing us. And I think I will not be aggressively party political, but I think you definitely can see when a government cares about its students. And I think we're in a position right now where it is very, very visible that students are not at the top of the priority list. And the problem is that, again, I think this is one of the big things that you notice as a SAB and as an activist in general, is that when you ignore the little things, they build into big things incredibly quickly. You have a generation of students here who are getting ignored, who are really struggling, particularly financially. And all that does is contribute to inequality, poverty, and endless issues that could quite easily be resolved. And it drives me insane when government approaches to HE just don't acknowledge some of the struggles. And one of the proposals that we got through last year was a recommendation from the all-party parliamentary group to reintroduce student maintenance grants. That is committed, that is written down, that is in all formal papers. And yet, it's been a year now and it's not gone anywhere. And it's like, this is formal government legislation, like this should be going somewhere. And again, COVID has really delayed a lot of that, but also in general, like students are being ignored, and this is the time to fight that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was going to click like we do at NUS, but it's too difficult on the call. Yeah, completely. And I think interestingly, and I was going to mention this at the start, but I'll mention it now. Part of that rhetoric from government around student unions in particular, and student activism, has been defining the work student unions do in particular as niche activism. That was used by the Department of Education in a report earlier this year, late last year. And to me, all these things on here aren't niche. These are kind of key things in the world at large, but also affect students every day. So the idea that students should just concentrate on their studies and their extracurricular activities, and student unions are all about this niche activism is for the birds, as a friends would say. Student unions are important to drive change in and students involved in that on every level in every sector of society. So that's some context. The next slide is visual. We're all visual. Well, we're not all visual learners, but hopefully some people out there and in the room are visual learners. So here's some examples of, in my mind, the triumphs and successes of student activism, and I'll bring Effie in a sec as well. So to me, students at the forefront of driving change at the minute. On the top left there, which people will notice, is York Minster, is some environmental activists. I think lots of them. I can see an ex-YUSU part-time officer in there. So I think that's them. So the environment and ethics part-time officer and collective fighting for environmental justice there. And that was a march to ask York County Council to declare a climate emergency. I don't know if you remember that, Effie, which was successful. I think York County Council did declare a climate emergency, which it had to do, but obviously was triggered by some student activism there. Excellent. And then top right is at Oxford University, and I think it's Oriel, isn't it, Effie? The Roads Must Fall. That's a Roads Must Fall campaign during the COVID pandemic, I think last summer. So students asking for the Cecil Rhodes statue to be removed at Oxford. Unfortunately, I think that's an example of student activism having a really big role, but then not necessarily being followed through on by the authorities or the powers that be at Oxford University. Because I think the statue of Cecil Rhodes is still there. They've done a report, they've recommended it be removed, but they're still kind of working on the logistics of how that happens. But again, a real example of students, I think, at the forefront of fighting for racial justice. And in this manifestation, obviously, the removal of statues of disgusting colonialists and slavers. And then the bottom image is a £50 million sign, which is a very contemporary reference to the government in the last couple of days announcing £50 million worth of hardship funding for students because of COVID-19. Obviously, it's a tiny little amount in the grand scheme of things. I think at York it'll mean we get about 100 grand to dish out between students, and I don't know what that works out between students, maybe 30 quid each, but obviously for those in hardship as well. But I think it's a huge example of students around the country, and especially at York, signing petitions, writing up and letters, putting pressure on YUSU SABs to challenge the government and the university on approaches to COVID and how we support students, and just getting across the crappy situation lots of students are in, and the financial hardship without being able to do part-time work, and with families struggling and all that. So I think that's a real win for student activists, although the government needs to go further. Have you got anything on that, Effie? Or is that okay?
I think you summed it up well.
Thank you. Right, we're coming to the juicy bits. I'm going to call it juicy bits. So for those in the room and watching it back as well, I think a key thing, as well as being passionate around activism, is if you're embarking on your kind of initial journey, you're thinking about whether to run as a SAB, you're thinking about how to be an activist. I think it's difficult for you to. There's so many options, there's so many things happening. So this model that I found that you'll see on the screen there, by an amazing professor called Jasmine George Williams in the United States, who is at the University of, let me find it, Laverne, which is in California. Never heard of that university before. It's a prominent university in California. And she came up with this model that enables, obviously, staff and professionals and educators, I was going to call myself like me, educators like me, to help students and young people cultivate their own activist identity. But it's also a model that you can use as well to start thinking about and reflecting on your own activist identity. And we're going to focus on a couple of bits because it's quite long, but I'll go through it. So at the foundation of this model is soul work, which sounds all very American, but it's very cool. Knowing your role, which we'll talk about in greater detail next. Choosing your vehicle, so whether you want to be an elected officer, which is very apt for this workshop and now, or whether you want to be behind a grassroots organization, or you want to be a course rep, you want to get involved in art activism, you want to do graffiti in a legal way, whatever that is, it's being able to reflect on the skills you can bring and the options available for you. Finding your people is a massive one, I think, to be part of anything, but part of being activist as well. I think that's a real, for me, for my personal journey, finding people at university and in groups that I could relate to, that shared my values, was part of taking practical steps to become an activist, and then career options as well. Locating barriers is really important. That's kind of internal barriers to within, in order to go on your activist journey, but also external barriers as well to that next step. Radical compassion is super important. That's about kind of well-being and looking after yourself as an activist. There's so much, you could be an activist 24 hours a day at the minute on social media. So I think being radically compassionate towards yourself is really important. And then when you've got all those things, you're ready to change the world, according to Jasmine George Williams, which is great. But I'll just touch upon soul work initially, and then I'll come to the next couple of slides, which is knowing your role and choose your vehicle. But I was just going to come to you, Effie. So this soul work is all about finding, we talked about at the start, but those triggers and those motivations. What motivates you to become an activist? What motivates you to become a YUSU officer? What motivates you to get involved in change work? Why aren't you becoming an investment banker? Have there been any personal injuries? And it's all that kind of stuff that I think you need to go through at the start of your activist journey. So I was wondering about what your soul work was and when and how you did it, really.
That's a very deep question. I think again, a lot of it certainly started as as selfish as it is, as having felt hard done by and put out by that. And then it sort of evolved to saying, you know, this is bigger than me. This is a lot bigger than me. This isn't just a one-off experience. And then it grew to, how do I make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else?
Yeah.
And then it sort of, again, it sort of continues to evolve into not just how do I make sure this doesn't happen, but how do we stop it being bad at all and make it into a very positive thing? And it's sort of, my whole journey through it was trying to utilize my own experiences and sort of, I don't know how to phrase it other than say weaponize it, because I certainly did use my own experiences as a sort of knife to go after people with and say, this is what could happen. And I'm not even the worst case. So you need to be making changes. But, you know, I think a big mistake a lot of people can often make when they want to first start pursuing activism is this idea of doing it for, you know, I want to be the next Greta Thunberg. I want to be the next Stacey Abrams. And it's not, I think the best activists come from a place where it's not about you making a name for yourself. It's about making a sustainable change. And if you've got your heart in the right place, I think the success follows quite obviously from that. But if you're doing it from the start just to sort of be like, I want to be a famous activist, then you're kind of missing the point, really. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that there are a lot of people who, I don't know what the phrase is, but become activists and maybe do social media stuff, symbolic stuff, because that's, you know, that's good for their image, or it makes them feel good. I think that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That lots of activism will have some positive influence, but it's about you feeling better about yourself, which is, you know, is important, but it's not a sustainable form of kind of activist identity. Because to me, that kind of soul work is about working out how you're going to almost sacrifice yourself, or you're going to compromise things for, you know, for lasting change. You know, you've got to usurp some kind of status quo, and by that you have to give up some of your privilege, and that's difficult, isn't it? To commit to.
I think it's good because it starts, I think most people, it definitely starts in a sort of almost selfish way, because that's how a lot of these movements tend to start. I've seen a problem, I want to fix it, me, so-and-so. And then it grows. And so long as you acknowledge the growth is a really interesting part of the whole activist journey, because it can be really thankless work. It really can be. But at the same time, it can be horrifically rewarding. And it can be the greatest boost you've had to your mental health. It can be a really, really engaging and enjoyable experience as well. That, you know, you've got to be able to take the good with the bad. And so long as you're committed to doing that, then you've got the heart of the work you're doing in the right place.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so you guys in the room and out there, soul work kind of starts with, like Effie's talked about, you know, personally, it can be personal injustices or traumas. It can be a subject or a theme that you're particularly interested in. But really kind of ask yourself about those things, and find your values, find your people, find your soul. God, that sounded very high. I don't know what the word is, but anyway. So next slide. So I think I'll come to you again, Effie. Knowing your role, we'll focus on two aspects of the model that I talked about. So knowing your role and then the vehicles. I think knowing your role is really important, and obviously in the context of the elections is really important as well, if you want to put yourself forward or thinking about it. And these three, you know, they're not an exhaustive list, but they're the ones that I think are most important for our purposes. So agitator is a key one, and just out of interest, Effie, I'd be interested to see which one you think you are, or whether you fall into all three. Because I was just going to say, as a sabbatical officer or a elected person in YUSU, nationally, as a councillor, whatever, I think you kind of have to be, or many people are all three of these. But I'll just go through and then I'll come to you to find out. I was going to say alligator, but it says agitator. So an agitator, which I think is really important and is the core of most really successful activist movement, is a dramatic non-violent action, and it's the stuff we normally see on the telly and in the press and on social media. So it's those protests, those sit-ins, those really public displays of non-violent, I suppose, civil disobedience in a way. And then there's reformer as well. So I think it's important when you're thinking about your role to think about the skills you can bring, think about your values, think about, you know, if you are a person who thinks about you know, an area for change, sexual violence, for example? Are you the kind of person who can see yourself in a room with university management, or in a room with politicians, in a room at the table with a seat at the table? Yes, you might rip up the table and throw it at people, but can you see yourself making change in that way? And it's really important. And I would say that's obviously for SABs and part-time officers and elected positions, being a reformer is a key role. That's a key democratic route. And then change agent as well. And again, I reckon Effie was all three, but definitely a change agent. But being a change agent is part of kind of educating other people and involving other people. So I think students' unions and universities should be promoting change agency. You know, they should all be about putting students at the centre, educating students, but also being educated by students and involving students as much as possible. So an example of kind of change agents is campaigns, exhibitions, or radical project work. So project work you might do at a university or in the community, which involves citizens. So Effie, what are you? Are you all three?
I'd like to think I'm all three. I think this is a problem with it is as a SAB, you're in a tricky position sometimes, because I think being a reformer is probably the most important role you have for many people, in the broad scheme of things, because people need to view you as having that level of we all need to view as having a mandate. For you to make effective change with the university, they need to know that the students are behind you. And so being able to go down the democratic route and show people that you have the backing of the students is really important to allow the people you're trying to influence to respect you. I think change agent, I'd love to be a change agent. That made me very happy when you said that name. That's probably, I think, one of the most important things you can do, rather than necessarily just instantly be, because educating others and involving them in the work you're doing is the most important thing. It cannot be done alone, no matter what people try to tell you. If you try and do it alone without the backing of the students, you won't get anywhere. But agitator, I was definitely called an agitator by university staff. I was called all manner of things. I think radical. I got called radical a lot. And I was definitely viewed by a lot of them as being the sort of angry person who came into the room and told them what was what. But one of the big mistakes I think a lot of people make when they want to get into student politics is just being an agitator. Because if you come in and you're just like, I am angry at X, rah, 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 they'll be like, cool, okay, let's say it's the housing cost. I'm angry at the housing cost. Cool, yeah, that sucks. It's shit. There's nothing we can do. Soz pal. They won't respect you if you're just angry. And I think that's the problem, is no matter how angry you are, like, being angry doesn't earn you respect. And that's a problem, because I think it should. I think a lot of the work that you do from that point of view should get people to listen. But the problem is so many people forget, when they have that sort of agitator hat on, to also be proposing solutions, which I think the reformer and the change agent have as part of their identity. Like, you cannot go in as a SAB or a student activist and just say, I am angry at this thing, because there are millions and millions of things you can be angry at. And there's part of the reason that things like petitions and pledges and stuff can often fail is, well, of course everyone's going to be angry that this thing is happening, but at what point have you suggested any solution? And that's kind of the thing that you need to be able to do as a student activist, and particularly as an elected one and a reformer, is say, right, I'm angry at this, I'm agitated, this is a thing, but also this is the change, this is the reform, this is how I want it to change, and this is what I want you to do. And so long as you're providing that side, and you I'm losing my words. As long as you can encapsulate all three identities, you're far more likely to like create a sustainable change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you've summed that up really nicely, that as a SAB you probably have to do all three. I'm thinking of that when you're in university meetings, or whatever it might be, if you're an activist out in the community and working with politicians and other elected people, that you're more of a saboteur in the meeting than an agitator. You have to be that annoying person who continuously puts something on the agenda, racial inequality. I'm not going to stop talking about racial inequality just because it doesn't suit your interests or because it's not on the agenda. It's still there, and that to me is part of being an agitator. But you can do that in informal settings as well.
Yeah, definitely. Being able to put your issue on the table in any moment, from being in a big university meeting to happening to run into one of them in Derwent Cafe, like being able to keep that conversation constantly rolling until the change starts happening.
Yeah, definitely. I think with agitated, because we see that a lot, and I think that's what people see, like the university and media, and that's what we associate with being a student activist. All that kind of that sexy protest sitting stuff, but actually, it's an important foundation to most movements, but it isn't going to get you that kind of practical, sustainable change, systemic change. It's the start where other kind of ways of being an activist comes in. Yeah, cool. Right. So next slide. So once you've kind of done this soul work, I'm just feeling very hungry when I say soul work. I just want to eat food. When you've done this soul work and worked out what you know what your skills are and what your role could be, there might be multiple roles. I think choosing your vehicle is both difficult, but something that you have to do, and it's really important. We've got some lovely examples of student groups and student organisations in the image there. Ideas for you to get involved in. I'll come to that in a sec. But there are obviously different vehicles that you can choose. Scholarly activism is an interesting one, something that I'm particularly keen on, and I think something that our university and all universities should be about. I'm a big believer in what we call critical pedagogy, which is about creating critical citizens. I think education should be about creating critical citizens, not just good citizens. You know, we should be taught to challenge power, to challenge the spaces we're in, to challenge status quo, not just be good citizens, not just be the next wage slaves. That's my own personal view. That's not the views of YUSU, but that's certainly what I think when I think scholarly activism. But for you guys in the room and out there, scholarly activism could be anything. It could be an essay you're writing. It could be a certain take on an essay you're writing. It could be a dissertation topic. It could be, you know, going on to do a master's degree or a PhD and doing something really critical. But it also, to me, means kind of sharing knowledge, you know, online. In the current world, that could be a social media post. It could be an article that you share with friends and family or publicly. It's anything to do with knowledge that is all about changing the world. Are you a scholarly activist, Effie? I remember talking to you about your dissertation a few times.
I think so. I studied criminology, and my dissertation was on, it was called Trumped Up Terrorism, has the legitimization of the far right as a political force undermined the recognition of far right terrorism. So a lot of mine was on political activism and how one engages with that and violence and contextualizes it. But I also did a lot of work on my degree on systemic inequalities, racial inequalities. So when I was producing a lot of the BLM documents for YUSU, a lot of that was based on my own research that I'd had to do for my degree. So a lot of it was academic readings, but I think it gives you a really good backing to be able to debate people. When you've got some of that information, you can really understand where it's coming from, particularly given that, you know, I, as a middle-class white woman, haven't lived through a lot of these problems. So being able to go and read about the sort of lived experiences of people in a really broad, evidenced way is really, really good to give yourself a diverse backing with the activism that you do.
Yeah, definitely. And a good example of my brother's wife used to work, she's Indian, but she used to work in Myanmar, and obviously what's going on at the minute, the military's done a coup again and all this, and there's been lots online about, oh God, you know, democracy's ended. But actually, when you think about it through a scholarly activism lens, you start reading into it, you realize that Myanmar was never actually a democracy. So people all posting online about this, suddenly this is terrible. You know, we've gone from this democratic Nobel Peace leader to a military junta. If you read a bit more, it isn't actually that. You know, it never fully transitioned into democracy. This is my view again, not the views of YUSU. She was a bit of PR puppet and all that kind of stuff. But that just goes to show reading and educating yourself and others is really important, and is the foundation of great activism.
I will say one quick thing about the scholarly activism thing though, Nick, which is it's fantastic for a university like York, and if you're doing work as an internal work, because everybody here has a similar educational background in terms of what we're all doing. You know, we're all at York, we've all received the qualifications to get in here, so we're all at that sort of level of reading that we could understand most of the stuff that we're producing if we're doing it from a scholarly background. You have to remember, if you're doing external activism, that is not the case. and that you have a very privileged position as an educated person that a lot of other people don't have access to. So being able to adapt your tone and the work that you do to fit a far more diverse audience is going to be really important if scholarly activism is like your base. You need to ensure that other people are able to relate to what you're saying. Otherwise, you risk alienating yourself and the work you're doing, and it coming across as sort of, champagne socialism or champagne whatevering.
Yeah, I should have done a disclaimer at the start. Not the views of socialism.
Yeah,
anyway.
The socialism was only because I know the phrase champagne socialism.
Yeah, I think that's
an equivalent other one, because champagne studenting doesn't really work. It would be more like Smirnoff Ice studenting, but that doesn't get
champagne Toryism or something like that. Yeah, but I think that's a really, really good point. Like mobilizing people and that participatory ethic of good activism isn't always going to go down well if you're using words or language that other people don't understand. So taking people with you is good. Grassroots activism is another important vehicle, and I've used an example in the images there, the Last Taboo, which is an amazing student-led grassroots organisation at York that's currently doing some amazing work, raising awareness and challenging the university and others on sexual violence. So I think grassroots activism is really cool. And for you guys out there, just give you a bit of energy and fire. If there's a theme or an issue that you really care about, and there isn't a group, create one. I think, get together with friends and like-minded people and create one. Come to YUSU and see what we can do in terms of making a student group, or just form a group. And we, colleagues at the university and other students, I'm sure, be happy to form one. So yeah, if there isn't a group, it shouldn't be a barrier. It shouldn't feel like too much of a barrier. Start it. Symbolic activism as well. So I suppose that's deliberate actions to raise awareness. And the best example I could think of here is quite a recent one from York, Effie. I don't know if you know about the Progressive Pride crossing. I don't know if you've seen on social media recently, but I'm not quite sure where it is, but it's a crossing.
It's a spring lane into the car park.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah. So it's the LGBTQ others, and then some others, isn't it? Around Black Lives Matter and Black Pride as well. So that's a really good example of symbolic activism. And then public activism, what we talked about earlier, is another key vehicle. So there's protests, there's open letters, those public events. And then I've added one. So Jasmine Williams, who I used her model in this workshop, she didn't talk about this within her model, but I think radical political leadership for the purpose of this workshop and with Effie is really important. So I think if you are keen on being elected and running in kind of formal spaces and are worried about being too much of a radical or an activist, don't be. I think you can be a radical political leader, and I think student unions provide a great opportunity for students who I suppose have a critical mindset, who aren't just doing it for their CVs, to make real change and to express themselves and to hopefully grow that radical zest, if you like. So that's really important as well. I would describe Effie as a radical political leader. So yeah. If you don't mind me saying that,
in a good way, I hope.
Definitely in a good way. But also, I think thinking about councils and other areas of political leadership as well. I think we need more radical students and political leaders at the minute, which I think is very, very obvious with the current state of the world. So definitely don't see that as kind of being mutually exclusive. Okay, so my last slide, and then because the time is present, I'll come to you, Effie, for your final remarks. Is around student activists as leaders. So I think there's something a bit weird, and I don't know if you agree, Effie, about the university in particular, but I suppose in the media as well. Student activists being seen as separate from leaders. That student activists aren't seen as leaders, and I suppose SABs can't be activists because they're in these formal spaces and they're co-opted. So I just wanted to kind of delve into that a little bit with you, because I think for me, student activists are leaders in changing people's perceptions on campus. They're thought leaders, and we should see them as such. And I think you out there and you in the room deserve to be cultivated or developed as leaders as well. I think there's, the activities you'll get into, whether it's the grassroots stuff that we talked about, whether you put yourselves forward for election, you're going to build leadership qualities as an activist. So yeah, I don't think we should separate them. But yeah, I want to come to you on that, Effie, just on that idea of student activists as leaders.
I think you've got to remember that in the whole process of running to be a SAB or a student leader in some way is people are voting for you. They are choosing you to be their leader. And I think something that often can trip people up when it comes to activism is the idea that organic leadership in activism is some, everyone sort of collects together and somebody becomes the figurehead as a more sort of natural progression. But this is entirely that. And it's almost silly to remove the democratic process of leadership elections from the sort of organic creation, because that is how you've come to this point. You've put yourself forward to be a student leader because you've grown through the stuff you're already doing. And so it would almost be silly to separate that, because just because you've put yourself through a democratic process doesn't remove the organic qualities that you had as an activist beforehand. Yeah. I think being a SAB is fantastic. It's a really good opportunity because you have been chosen by the students to be the leader. You are respected as that by the university and externally. And it puts you in a really, really good position to make the change that you often didn't have before as just an activist. But it also doesn't detract from your activism. It really doesn't. The role is very much what you choose to make of it. If you want to be a radical political leader, if you want to be out there constantly making change and fighting the good fight, so to speak, you really can do that. And it's about finding your own leadership style. You are a leader, and that is a really, really good thing. But also being a leader is entirely what you choose to make of it. You don't need to be like a former SAB or a different leader you've seen before. You don't need to model yourself on somebody else. You can take what you want and the elements you like of your activism, and you can let that power your leadership style. And I think that's what I tried to do in my work, was go, right, there are certain bits that I've liked out of some other people that I've worked with that I really want to emulate, but also I want my leadership style to be X, Y, and Z and different in these ways, and let that power me. And sort of it's what won me 2 elections, really, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Shout out to that. I think that's a really good point. I think that, student activists and then, SABs and part-time officers and other elected officials come in all shapes and sizes. And I think it's not for sabbatical positions aren't for a certain kind of person who's better able to speak to university colleagues in meetings, for example, or think too much about, or focus too much on the position and power, rather than that kind of ability to disrupt and to think about the community and making meaningful change, which you can do as an elected official and as a leader as well. Okay, last couple of things from me. I suppose student activists building transferable skills is something that maybe isn't talked about much. I think we talk about student activism as being important and as important for making change on campus and beyond. But I think, including that in academic literature and student unions at universities, I don't think it's offered as a in the career guidance, or the career team talks about the benefits of being a student activist. But I think there are a huge number of transferable skills that you can gain from being a student activist. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, kind of project management, thinking about how you make change, talking to diverse people, other students, university colleagues, people in different areas of authority, all those things. I'm thinking about your next, your job interview or applications. All that stuff is really useful. And I think the final point on that is that, we wouldn't be promoting you to do student activism or get involved just for your next job or a CV builder. But I mean, for me, as a recruiter, I'm looking at the values that people can develop and can demonstrate from being a student activist, rather than just the fact that you've done it, rather than the fact that you were in a position of power. It's the values and the commitment to making change that is going to get you jobs within charities or change-making organizations. So I think that's another key thing to think about. Okay, I think that's